My name is Nora Bennett. I am 32 years old. And if you asked my father to describe me, he would probably pause, look slightly uncomfortable, and say something vague about how I was always finding my way. What he would not say, what he never said directly, is that he treated me like a bad investment, like someone whose potential had already been calculated, found lacking, and quietly written off. I was the daughter who showed up, who worked, who kept the house running in ways nobody noticed. I was the quiet one, and quiet in my family was just another word for invisible. For 9 years, I carried a sentence my father said at our kitchen table like it was carved into my chest. The night I brought my loan papers home, the ones I needed for college, he looked them over, set down his coffee, and told me that Rachel had real potential. Rachel was my younger sister. Prettier, louder, easier to love in the way families love the child who reflects them best. He said I had expensive dreams. He did not sign. And I watched my future get quietly rescheduled into delayed semesters, second jobs, unpaid bills, and a version of myself that learned to want less out loud. Last month, something happened that I am still processing. In a probate office in Columbus, our family lawyer opened a trust folder. He looked at me in a way I did not immediately understand. And my father, the man who always had something to say, who entered every room with the certainty of someone who believed the story ended his way, froze. Completely. Even my mother, who had spent decades perfecting the art of pretending everything was fine, stopped. For one strange, suspended moment, nobody in that room was performing anymore. My father had walked in expecting what he always expected.
Praise. Control.
An ending where I sat quietly while the family rewarded the right people for loyalty and obedience, one more time. But 4 questions arrived at once and changed the air in the room. Why had my grandfather kept my unsigned loan forms all these years? Why did Rachel look nervous before the reading even started? What exactly had my grandfather witnessed that night at our kitchen table? And why was the lawyer holding a second sealed packet that nobody had mentioned before? So let me ask you something directly. If a parent blocked your future and called it wisdom, would you forgive them? Yes or no? Because before that folder opened, there was a winter kitchen, a blue pen, a bent certificate, and one refusal that quietly rerouted everything. And I did not know then that somebody else in that house had been keeping score the entire time. From the outside, we looked like exactly the kind of family that had everything arranged correctly. Brick house in Dublin, Ohio. Church on Sundays, where my father shook hands with the right people and my mother wore the right smile. A kitchen that smelled like something warm was always in the oven. We were polished in the way that matters most to people who care about appearances, which is to say, we looked fine as long as you did not look too closely. My father, Martin, ran an insurance office. He loved talking about risk and value, about who is worth investing in and who is likely to disappoint you. Looking back, I realize he applied that same framework to his daughters. My mother, Ellen, did what she had always done. She read his moods like weather forecasts and turned them into family policy. When Martin was proud of Rachel, we all celebrated Rachel. When Martin was quiet about me, we were all quiet about me. My younger sister got softness and second chances. I got standards. High ones, applied consistently, and acknowledged almost never. The memory that stays sharpest happened when I was 14. I had placed a debate certificate on the kitchen counter, right beside the fruit bowl, before dinner. I had timed it carefully. I wanted my father to see it when he walked in. He came through the door, dropped his keys directly on top of it, and spent the next 20 minutes talking about Rachel making the varsity soccer team. The certificate sat there with his keys pressing into the corner, and nobody mentioned it once. Later that evening, he told my aunt, loud enough that I could hear from the hallway, that Rachel had leadership energy. He said I was only good at paper things. I watched that corner bend slowly under the weight of his keys, and I said nothing. I had already started learning that saying nothing was the safest available option. I kept that certificate anyway. I put it inside a green folder with honor slips and scholarship letters that nobody in my family ever wanted to sit down and discuss. By senior year, the folder had stopped feeling like pride and had started feeling like evidence. I just did not know yet what it was evidence of. What I could not have known then was why my grandfather would one day remember that folder, when everyone else in the family had decided long ago that my work had never really happened at all. The pattern became impossible to ignore once money entered the conversation. At 16, my father paid for Rachel to attend a soccer camp 3 states away. Hotel, gear, gas, registration, all of it, without discussion, without hesitation. That same month, when I asked him to cover my standardized exam fees, he called them a luxury, not an investment, not something worth considering. A luxury, as if wanting to qualify for college was an indulgence I needed to reconsider. At 17, I won a partial scholarship and picked up a part-time job at the school library, stacking shelves and checking out books after class. My father told relatives at a family dinner that I was responsible because I knew not to expect much. He said it like it was a compliment, like learning to shrink your ambitions was a character strength worth admiring. That same season, Rachel borrowed my mother's car without permission and came home with a dented bumper and a story that changed twice. She was called spirited. The word my family used for Rachel's mistakes was always something that sounded like a personality trait worth keeping. The memory that still sits heaviest happened in the spring of my senior year. My school counselor called about an honors program in Cincinnati, a genuine opportunity that could have reshaped my entire academic path. My father took the call on speakerphone in the kitchen. I stood in the hallway and listened to him tell my counselor, in a calm and reasonable voice, that Nora is bright, but we are not pouring money into a degree that will not pay us back. He hung up and went back to his dinner. Nobody at the table said a word. What followed was 2 years of math that I kept track of privately because nobody else was. Textbooks, exam fees, bus fare, dorm deposits, late penalties, covered through savings I had built from weekend shifts, a personal loan from a close friend, and hours of unpaid tutoring I provided to Rachel because my mother asked me to, and I did not yet know how to say no. When I added it honestly, the gap came to nearly $20,000. At my graduation, my grandfather pressed $200 into my palm, leaned close, and said, "Keep every paper." I thought he meant tax records. I did not yet understand that he had already seen what was coming, and that he was quietly making sure my father would never be able to rewrite what had actually happened. 9 years passed. Then, on a Tuesday morning, the trigger arrived by certified mail. My grandfather had died in hospice after a short decline, and a formal letter from a downtown Columbus law office informed me that the family was summoned to a trust reading that Friday. I stood at my apartment door, holding the envelope for longer than made sense. My hands were shaking, not because I expected anything financial, not because I had spent years imagining a moment like this. They shook because in our family, grief and dread had always traveled together. One never arrived without the other quietly following it inside. The responses came within 20 minutes of each other. Rachel texted first. It was 5 words. "Please do not make this weird." My mother sent something longer, more carefully worded, the kind of message she had always been good at composing, the ones that sounded reasonable on the surface while communicating something else entirely underneath. She said the day was about honoring Grandpa, and that a professional setting was not the place for reviving old resentment. I read it twice and recognized the architecture of it immediately. It was a preemptive instruction dressed as a gentle reminder. My father called last. He did not ask whether I was doing all right. He did not mention grief, or the funeral, or anything about the man we had both just lost. He said 3 things: show up on time, dress respectfully, and do not perform your victim story in front of strangers. Then he hung up. I sat at my kitchen table and felt the heat rise through my chest the way it always had. But this time something was different. This time I waited, and I felt it cool. Because I was not 19 years old anymore, standing in that kitchen asking for a signature, and being told I was not worth the risk. I got up and pulled the old green folder from the back of my closet. When I lifted it from the shelf, a business card slipped out from between the pages and fell onto the floor. I picked it up. Samuel Price, attorney at law. My grandfather's lawyer. I had seen that name before, on a Christmas envelope my father had grabbed from the mail pile faster than the moment deserved. By Thursday night, I knew one thing with complete certainty. I was not walking into that office empty-handed. I called Samuel Price on Wednesday morning, half expecting to be redirected to a voicemail or handed off to an assistant with a polite brush-off. Instead, he answered on the second ring. He asked me to confirm my full name and date of birth before saying anything else. Then he said something that stopped me completely, that he had hoped I would call before Friday. Not that he was glad I called, that he had hoped I would. There was a difference in that phrasing, and I understood it immediately. He would not discuss the specifics of the trust over the phone, but he told me that my grandfather had left a formal written statement regarding a financial decision that had directly altered my education path. He said it carefully, the way lawyers say things when the words matter more than the tone. I sat on my kitchen floor and felt something loosen in my chest that I had not realized was still pulled tight. It felt like a window opening in a room that had been sealed for years. I spent Wednesday night and all of Thursday gathering documents in layers. First came the original loan packet, the pages my father had refused to sign, with his blank signature lines still waiting. Then I found the email, the one where he had written in plain text that co-signing for me would be irresponsible because Rachel might still need financial support down the road. After that came the budgeting notebook I had kept through those 2 years, the pay stubs, the fee notices, and the official semester withdrawal record that showed in precise administrative language exactly what his refusal had cost me and when. Samuel told me to bring originals, not copies. He also mentioned, carefully, that my grandfather's personal accountant had maintained independent records, and that one witness had written down an account of what happened at our kitchen table the night my father refused to sign. The smear campaign began on Thursday, right on schedule. My mother called to say that grief was clearly making me dramatic. Rachel posted something on social media about relatives who weaponize family stories whenever money becomes involved. My father sent an email stating that any disruption I caused on Friday would only confirm what the family already suspected about my stability. I read all of it. I saved all of it. Then I organized my folder, set my alarm, and went to sleep. So let me ask you honestly, when a family unanimously calls their calmest member dramatic, who exactly are you inclined to believe? Friday came anyway. And with it, a room my father had already decided he controlled. The probate office sat on the second floor above a bank, accessible by a narrow elevator that opened into a reception area of polished wood paneling and muted carpet. Everything about the space was designed to make conflict lower its voice. The soft lighting, the heavy furniture, the particular silence that professional rooms use to signal that emotions are permitted here only in their most restrained form. My father loved rooms like that. He was always at his most confident in spaces where the architecture itself asked everyone to stay calm and reasonable. He walked in first. Navy suit, shoulders back. One hand resting on Rachel's shoulder in a way that looked like affection but functioned more like presentation. Here is the family. Here is the daughter. Here is the future I selected and am proud to display. My mother followed just behind them, wearing the smile she reserved for rooms where impressions needed to be managed carefully. I arrived before all of them. I took a chair near the far end of the table, placed the green folder directly in front of me, and said nothing. I had learned a long time ago that silence in that family was consistently mistaken for submission. They always underestimated quiet. They always had. Rachel glanced down at my shoes almost immediately and asked, loud enough for the cousins seated nearby to hear, whether I had worn discount flats to a legal meeting. 2 cousins laughed. The family script had returned right on cue, same as it always did, comfortable and automatic. Samuel Price entered the room with Linda Cho, the trust administrator, and a paralegal carrying a set of sealed packets organized by colored tabs. Before Samuel had even settled into his chair, my father leaned back and began explaining my grandfather's intentions to the room, talking about loyalty, about family proximity, about the people who had stayed close and shown up consistently. Nobody had asked him to speak yet. 10 minutes before the formal reading began, Rachel leaned toward me and whispered that if I had prepared any kind of statement, this was my last opportunity to save myself the embarrassment of delivering it. I looked at her. Then I looked at my father. And I understood in that moment that they both still believed my silence meant I had nothing. So as Samuel reached for the first envelope, I asked myself the only question that actually mattered. Do I keep the peace one more time? Or do I let the full record speak? Samuel opened with routine language. Dates, property descriptions, the procedural formalities that trust readings always begin with, the kind of careful, measured legal phrasing that gives a room time to settle before anything consequential arrives. He moved through a few small bequests, sentimental items, modest amounts designated for distant relatives. My father visibly relaxed as each one was read. His shoulders dropped slightly. He uncapped his water bottle. Rachel crossed her legs and leaned back in her chair with the particular ease of someone who believes the ending of a story has already been written in their favor. Then Samuel paused, looked down at the document, and said that the trust contained a separate education restitution provision and a formal written statement from my grandfather explaining specifically why that provision existed. Linda Cho began passing printed copies down both sides of the table. My father reached for his before it fully reached him, and I watched his fingers tighten around the paper before he had finished reading the first paragraph. He spoke before anyone else could. His voice was controlled, measured, the tone he used when he needed a room to see him as the reasonable one. He said he had acted responsibly throughout my upbringing because some children presented safer investments than others. He said I had always been emotional. He said I was sitting in a legal office blaming him for decisions and circumstances that were ultimately the result of my own choices. I let him finish completely. Then I opened the green folder and placed 4 things on the table in front of me: the unsigned loan papers with his empty signature line, the email in which he had written his reasoning in his own words, the handwritten work ledger from those 2 years, and the official semester withdrawal notice. Samuel read my grandfather's letter aloud. In it, my grandfather stated that he had personally witnessed Martin refuse educational support for Nora while making a separate verbal promise of larger financial assistance to Rachel during that same week. He described the act as both punitive and deliberately deceptive. Linda Cho confirmed that the estate accountant's independent records supported the provision entirely, including funds my grandfather had set aside to repay my documented losses, with 9 years of compounded growth applied. My aunt covered her mouth with both hands. A cousin whispered something that sounded like, "Oh my God." My father went pale, then flushed red, then settled into a stillness I had never seen on him before. Samuel finished by reading the clause that removed my father from any advisory role over the trust and assigned sole administrative control to me. I looked at my father directly and said the sentence I had been carrying for 9 years. You do not get to call sabotage parenting anymore. The room did not explode the way confrontations in movies do. It tightened. The air changed quality, became denser and more careful, and for a long moment, nobody moved. My father was the first to speak. He requested a recess in the particular voice he used when a spreadsheet had produced a number that embarrassed him in front of colleagues, controlled, clipped, professionally calm in a way that was meant to signal that the problem was procedural rather than personal. Rachel said my grandfather had clearly been manipulated in his final months. She said it with conviction, as if the statement explained everything and closed the matter. My mother began crying quietly but kept her eyes fixed on the papers in front of her, which told me more about her state of mind than the tears did. Samuel did not argue with any of it. He simply repeated, in the same level tone he had used throughout, that the trust language was valid, properly witnessed, notarized, and supported entirely by records maintained outside the family home by an independent accountant. That quiet restatement of documented fact ended the fantasy faster and more completely than any argument I could have made on my own. My father followed me into the hallway during the brief recess. He stood close and said that I was humiliating him over a financial decision that any sensible parent would have made under the same circumstances. I looked at him and said that I was not humiliating him. My grandfather had documented him humiliating himself, and I was simply refusing to keep covering it up. He had nothing to say to that. He went back inside. 2 relatives approached me afterward with apologies of the incomplete variety, the kind people offer when they want to receive credit for acknowledging discomfort without actually admitting the role they played in it. I accepted what they offered in that moment, clearly and without coldness. But I accepted it for the moment only, not for the full history that sat behind it. Before I left, Samuel handed me a small handwritten note my grandfather had left separately. In it, he explained that he had kept copies of everything because truth tends to disappear inside families that have been trained to protect their loudest member. That single line stayed with me longer than any of the financial figures did. And the figures changed everything. I walked out of that building with the green folder under my arm, and for the first time in 9 years, the first clear shape of a life that was finally moving forward. The aftermath arrived more slowly than any version of this moment I had imagined. There was no dramatic reversal, no sudden flood of acknowledgement from the people who had spent years looking past me. The trust process moved through its legal stages methodically. The debt was cleared. My documented losses were reimbursed with the growth my grandfather had quietly built into the provision over 9 years, and my share of the house proceeds was transferred into an account that carried only my name. I sat with my laptop at my kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon and looked at that balance for a long time without doing anything else. My father sent 3 separate messages over the following 2 weeks. The first blamed confusion, his own, the lawyers, the circumstances. The second blamed grief, suggesting that my grandfather had not been thinking with full clarity toward the end. The third asked in careful and neutral language what some form of redistribution might reasonably look like going forward. I left all 3 unanswered. Not out of anger, but because I had finally learned the difference between a conversation and a negotiation disguised as one. My mother mailed a card. It said that families should not allow paperwork to outrank love. I read it twice and then laughed, genuinely, unexpectedly, because paperwork had been the one thing in my life that had consistently loved me back. It had remembered what people preferred to forget. I used the money with intention. A portion went toward finishing the graduate certificate program I had postponed years earlier. A portion went directly into savings, building the kind of financial floor I had never been allowed to stand on. A smaller portion replaced my aging car before winter arrived. I was not interested in anything extravagant. Stability was the luxury I had always actually wanted. My support system became cleaner and clearer. A friend from my library years who had witnessed more than she ever commented on. My workplace supervisor, who had written me a reference letter without hesitation. Two cousins who privately admitted they had seen the favoritism for years and had not known what to do with that knowledge. And a therapist who helped me identify, without judgment, the role I had been unconsciously playing inside my own family story. One Saturday morning, I opened the green folder again and touched the bent corner of that debate certificate from when I was 14. I realized it no longer felt like evidence of my smallness. It felt like proof that I had survived being measured by the wrong instrument entirely. The last unanswered question answered itself quietly. My grandfather had not missed a single thing. Once I understood that, healing stopped feeling like something sentimental and started feeling like something solid beneath my feet. Peace looks ordinary now, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment. Early coffee before the apartment fills with light. A phone that stays quieter than it used to. Work I chose deliberately, not out of desperation or survival. Bills paid on time without the low hum of anxiety that used to run underneath everything. And a closet where the green folder rests calmly on a shelf beside documents that carry my signature, a lease, a certificate, an account statement, a life that belongs to me in ways that are practical and real and nobody can revise. I still hear my father's voice sometimes. The line about not being a safe investment surfaces occasionally, the way old recordings do. But it lands differently now. It no longer arrives as a forecast of what I am capable of becoming. It sounds like what it always actually was, a record of his character in a specific moment and the limitation he chose to carry. That realization did not come from anger. It came from distance and time, and finally having enough solid ground under me to hear the words without flinching. If this story has landed somewhere real for you, let it remind you of three things. Boundaries are not cruelty. Receipts are not revenge. And calm, documented truth has the capacity to outlast even the most practiced family system built on denial and selective memory. I want to ask you one final question, and I want you to answer it honestly. Do parents who play favorites ever stop on their own, or do consequences have to be the ones to teach them? I did not win this by ruining my father.
I want to be clear about that.
I won by refusing to keep carrying a lie that had been slowly crushing me for 9 years. The weight I put down was not his reputation. It was the false version of myself I had been maintaining to keep everyone else comfortable. And next time, I will tell you about the holiday dinner where my aunt arrived determined to rewrite the family history and discovered, too late, that I keep every paper. I hope you enjoy this video. Please like, subscribe, and share. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next video. Until then, take care and goodbye.